This will have to be our last question. Go ahead, sir.
In recent time, I would probably identify the most recent U.S. election as the turning point for this. And I'm saying that as an American citizen. This is my first time living in Canada. I've noticed that public discourse has taken to elevate fascism as the ultimate evil. And maybe rightfully so. You know, there were many horrific things committed by fascist states in the 20th century. And you see people, you know, like Facebook cover photos, like bash the fash. You see stickers on laptops, this machine kills fascists. It is, you know, there's this big, like, backlash against fascism and the horrors that it caused. But in spite of that, you don't see the same reaction to the horrors and the genocide that were caused by socialist and communist states in the 20th century. You do not... You see people who virtue signal endlessly about how horrible the Holocaust was, about how awful these things were, and then just hand wave away the famine genocide of the Ukraine, the Great Leap Forward. They think these things are inconsequential or even necessary sacrifices for the rise of the greater good of socialism or communism. And I personally find that morally reprehensible, and I can't understand where that comes in, how you can stand there and be so opposed to this genocide, but say that this genocide is somehow just, oh, it's not a problem. And why do you think that, how do you think that disconnect happens? How do you think people can convince themselves of that? And why do you think that happens?
It's a great question. You know, my house is covered with art from the Soviet era. And I have a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is to remind me of what happened. Part of it is to watch the struggle between the art and the propaganda on the canvases sort of in real time. You know, I'm very interested in that. But I would never decorate my house with Nazi regalia, you know? And you think, well, why is that exactly? It's not like I don't know that what happened in the communist regimes was utterly reprehensible. Why is it? And perhaps it's not acceptable to have, you know, socialist realist paintings in your house. But it's certainly more acceptable, or it seems that way, than to have paintings from the Nazi era, let's say. So then you think, well, why is that exactly? And I think, you know, back in 1918, at the dawn of the Russian Revolution, when Europe was in flames and in ruins and the monarchical societies were collapsing and the Industrial Revolution was in full force and there was terrible poverty and terrible inequality, the dream of universal brotherhood was a compelling dream, the dream of egalitarianism. And maybe, who knows how much of it was motivated by genuine benevolence? Some, at least. It's very difficult to see that the Nazi phenomena was ever generated by any genuine benevolence. That's very difficult to make a case for. So maybe you can forgive the communist utopians 100 years ago because they didn't know what they were getting in for. People had warned them. Dostoevsky warned them. Nietzsche warned them. But still. And then the other thing, too, is the problem of inequality. It's like the problem of inequality is a real problem, and it doesn't go away. Like, it's very difficult when you walk down Bloor Street, for example, in Toronto, and you see homeless people, alcoholics and drug addicts who are struggling, and the mentally ill who are on the street, and they're in their little domain of hell. It's really difficult for that to not tear at your heartstrings and say, well, isn't the world an unjust place or an unfair place, which it is. And so you can see the never-ending wellsprings of motivation to support the oppressed. And I think the fact that the communist dogma at least had that as part of its initiating ethos is partly what seems to make it forgivable. I also think it's easier for people to identify why fascism is wrong. We can say, look, racial superiority, no. Okay, it's pretty simple, right? It's 3 words. You can really get it. But equality of outcome? It's like, that's really wrong. It's really wrong. But it's not so obvious why, right? It isn't, you can't just say equality of outcome, no, and have everyone clap. Because it isn't as, well, and that's the thing. It's really difficult to isolate the pathological elements in radical left-wing thought. Because they're not self-evidently pathological. Like, there's this old cliche, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. It's like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. We have needs. It's like, let's have them fulfilled. And, well, you have an ability. Well, like, manifest it. It's like, well, it doesn't work in practice. In fact, it's murderous in practice. And it's a great catastrophe in some sense that it's murderous in practice. So I just think maybe part of it is it's just a hell of a lot harder to learn why it's wrong. That combined with, the genuine outpouring of compassion for the oppressed. And which is like, who's for poverty? No one, right? And inequality is a painful reality. It's painful for everyone. Even people who are self-righteous about their status, let's say, in the depths of their soul, the fact of the struggling still rips at them. And so, it's a more difficult lesson for us to learn. So, yeah.
Thank you. To those people lined up at the mics, I'm sorry for leaving you hanging. I'm sure we could go on all night if we had the time, but we must call this to a close. I would like to salute you for your patience and your dedication in the face of the noise from outside. Very nicely done. Well done.
Yes.
As you no doubt are aware, Professor Peterson has written an international bestseller. It's called 12 Rules for Life. There are some for sale in the hall. Now, before you go, let me just say this. You have participated in what I would consider to be an important step in the life of this university. And for that, we should thank you. So thank you for coming, and thank you for your support. Professor Peterson may be the most important intellectual voice in this country today, and I would like to thank him very much for coming.
So
Good night. Be safe.
I just have one small thing to say.
Hold on.
I would very much like to stay and talk with a bunch of you, and I generally do that, but I can't do it today because I have to go back to Toronto, and I'm going to Australia tomorrow. So I can't do that, even though I would like to. So I have to run off, and then I have to drive back to Toronto. But despite that, thank you very much for coming and for being patient and all of that. Yeah.
Earlier when you talked about criminality and creativity trends in men peaking at 14, it reminded me of something you said. I think it was Joe Rogan talking about SJWs and how they create their own chaos, talking about how adolescents have this drive to change the world. And I was wondering if those three, the criminality, creativity, drive to change the world, are linked, and if so, if they manifest differently in men and women, and if they kind of come from the same area.
Well, I think they are linked. But I'm going to concentrate more on the second part of your question. So I'm going to ask you guys to think about something. So I talked to a friend of mine the other day. He's a very, very smart guy. And we've been talking about, well, all the sorts of things that we've been talking about tonight for a long time. And we were talking about the relative evolutionary roles of men and women. This is speculative, obviously. And because our research did indicate, it's tentative research so far, that the SJW sort of equality above all else philosophy is more prevalent among women. It's predicted by the personality factors that are more common among women. So agreeableness and high negative emotion. Primarily agreeableness. But in addition, it's also predicted by being female. And that's interesting because in most of the personality research that I've done, and as far as I know in the literature more broadly speaking, most of the time you can get rid of the attitudinal differences between men and women, or at least reduce them by controlling for personality. So if you take a feminine man and a masculine woman, then, the poles reverse. But that didn't seem to be the case with political correctness. And so I've been thinking about that a lot, because Well, men are bailing out of the humanities like mad, and pretty much out of the universities except for STEM. The women are moving in like mad, and they're also moving into the political sphere like mad. And this is new, right? We've never had this happen before, and we do not know what the significance of it is. It's only 50 years old. And so we were thinking about this, and so I don't know what you think about this proposition, but imagine that historically speaking, it's something like women were responsible for distribution and men were responsible for production. Something like that. And maybe that's only the case really in the tight confines of the immediate family, but that doesn't matter because that's most of the evolutionary landscape for human beings anyways. What the women did was make sure that everybody got enough. Okay, and that seems to me to be one of the things that's driving, at least in part, the SJW demand for equity and equality. It's like, let's make sure everybody has enough. It's like, well, look, fair enough, you know, I mean, you can't argue with that. But there's an antipathy between that and the reality of differential productivity, you know, because people really do differ in their productivity. So, all right, so to answer your question fully, I do think that the rebellious tendency of adolescence is associated both with that criminality spike, especially among men, and with creativity. Yes. I think that the SJW phenomena is different, and I think it is associated, at least in part, with the rise of women to political power. And we don't know what women are like when they have political power, because they've never had it. I mean, there's been queens, obviously, and that sort of thing. There's been female authority figures, and females have wielded far more power historically than feminists generally like to admit. But this is a different thing. And we don't know what a truly female political philosophy would be like. But it might be, especially if it's not been well examined and it isn't very sophisticated conceptually. It could easily be, well, let's make sure things are distributed equally. Well, yeah, but sorry, that's just not going to fly.
Do you think in terms of the West with the SJWs, and you talked about last lecture as well, creating chaos when there is none, otherwise it'd be static, do you think there would be any validity in saying that in a country like Canada where we're pretty gender equal, is there any merit to thinking SJWs are trying to create chaos even when there arguably is none on a mass level? Obviously there's still problems.
Why would they do that?
Otherwise it would be static. And that drive,
well,
it wouldn't, but I'm just
so
wondering.
I read this quote once, and I don't remember who said it. It might have been Robert Heinlein, for crying out loud, science fiction author. That springs to mind, but it probably wasn't. And the proposition was that men tested ideas and that women tested men. And I kind of like that. There's something about that, you know. And now, obviously, it's an overgeneralization, but we also don't know to what degree women test men sheerly through provocation. It's a lot, because like if you want to test someone, you don't have a like little conversation with them. Like you poke the hell out of them and you say, okay, like I'm going to like go after you and see where your weak spots are. And it seems to me that in this constant protest and use of shame and all of that goes along with this sort of radical movement towards egalitarianism, that there's a tremendous amount of provocation. And God, I'm going to say this too, even though I shouldn't. But I don't believe this, but I'm trying to figure it out. You know, I thought it was absolutely comical when 50 Shades of Grey came out. Eh? I just thought that was just so insanely comical that at the same time, there's this massive political demand for like radical equality and say with regards to sexual behavior, and the fastest selling novel the world had ever seen was S&M Domination, right? It's like, oh, well, we know where the unconscious is going with that one, don't we? And sometimes I think, like, because one of the things that I've really tried to puzzle out, and it's not like I believe this, right? I'm just telling you where the edges of my thinking have been going, is that you have this crazy alliance between the feminists and the radical Islamists that I just do not get. It's like the feminists, it's like why they aren't protesting nonstop about Saudi Arabia is just completely beyond me. Like I do not understand it in the least. And I wonder too, I just wonder bloody well, this is the Freud in me, is like, is there an attraction, you know, is there an attraction that's emerging among the female radicals for that totalitarian male dominance that they've chased out of the West? And I mean, that's a hell of a thing to think, but after all, I am psychoanalytically minded, and I do think things like that. Because, like, I just can see no rational reason for it. The only other rational reason is that, well, the West needs to fall, and so the enemy of my enemy is...
My friend,
exactly. Now, what is it? I got that wrong, but...
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yes, exactly.
And that's why Islamists tend to vote liberal as well.
Yes, well, so that could be the case. But I'm not going to shake my suspicion about this unconscious balancing, because as the demand for egalitarianism and the eradication of masculinity accelerates, there's going to be a longing in the unconscious for the precise opposite of that, right? The more you scream for equality, the more your unconscious is going to admire dominance. And so, well, that's how you think if you're psychoanalytically minded. And, you know, I'm a great admirer of Freud. He knew a hell of a lot more than people like to think. And so, which is partly why everyone still hates him, even though it's been 100 years since he's, you know, really